Quiz, your final quiz is due on the, what is it, probably the 10th, I think. Is that what it is for you guys? It's written down on the thing. You have one more class Wednesday. Wednesday's our last class before finals. And remember the updated final. Look on your syllabi, change it. I have the 16th as the final. That is incorrect. It's incorrect on two scores. First, it says that it's Wednesday at 8 a.m. Clearly, that's where I'm mistaken. I carried over the other class that I have that meets at 8 a.m. Your final is on Monday, and it is Monday the 14th, just a reminder. And I'll send an email reminder again, but Monday the 14th, 11 to 1 p.m. Make sure you write that down. Put that in your phones, on your calendar. Etch it into your arm. Yeah, use your etch. No, don't etch-a-sketches are too impermanent. No etch-a-sketch. That would be foolish. So that's the main change. Today, I want to wrap up our discussion of Aristotle. And I think I stopped right in the middle. It's unfortunate. We were right in the middle of the dialogue, the presumed dialogue between Aristotle and Jean-Paul Sartre, if they were alive, if they were talking about the meaning and purpose of life. This is how I think that conversation would ultimately go. So I'll back up a little bit to review, and then we'll finish the conversation. And then we'll move into Maria Lugones' article, which was a bit long. I couldn't figure out how to cut it up and have it continue to make sense, so I had to read the whole thing. But you had a whole weekend to do it, and I hope you got a lot out of it. You'll see how it connects both with our discussion on George Yancey's elevator case, and I'll reference how those connect. But also it looks forward with her understanding of playfulness to our discussion of humor, which I hope to get to today. I actually want to start on my final discussion with you on the philosophy of humor. So the semester is sort of bookended. You started the semester with looking at the parallels between a humorous and a philosophical attitude. I'll briefly remind you of that and get at some more of the details and look at some debates about why it is that we laugh about things that are humorous. I think it ties in with our initial discussion. But also, as I've included here for the 9th, the last class, a video lecture. If you can't watch it by Wednesday, that's fine, but I encourage you to watch it before finals. It gets at more of the details than I have time to cover in this class on the role that a humorous attitude can offer, in particular with respect to what Maria Lugones calls world traveling, but also in a more perhaps unexpected sense on, how should we put it, a mode of resistance to a certain kind of oppression. And I'll talk about that a little bit next time. But the video gives you a lot more overview, and it gives you a lot of examples of comedians who utilize what I would call subversive humor. Punching from below, not punching from above. Punching from above would be laughter and humor that's an attempt to attack and maintain an unjust status quo. Humor that is mockery, ridicule, and so on. I think there's a difference between those two. And Aristotle was in fact concerned about that. He didn't have a distinction between humor that is ridiculing and humor that is subversive. He just thought there was a concern that, if we get to his chart, in fact, right there is where we left off, where we covered a little bit of this already, we're concerned that somebody who takes wittiness to its extreme becomes a buffoon, and that's a problem. The buffoon might oftentimes engage in attempts at humor that ridicule others, that is illiberal or unpleasant or unkind. Aristotle and Plato were both concerned about that. We'll see, however, that he does still call that a virtuous mean. So that's all I want to do. I want to remind us what a virtue is for Aristotle. Remember, he's in mid-discussion with Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist. And we'll review some of the basic themes of existentialism that were relevant to this class and will be relevant to next semester, where I'll see you all for the contemporary class, contemporary philosophy class, which for those of you who have early enrollment, what do they call that? Priority enrollment? Is that what it's called? Priority registration, that's it. You can start signing up for classes now. When does everyone else get to sign up? Next week? Oh, yes, right. It varies over time. But for those of you who can sign up now, sign up for the contemporary philosophy class, because there's limited seating. You need to sign up soon. Act now. Call now. Has anyone ever listened to a commercial and it tells you to call now? You go, I better do it. And you call right away. Nobody? All right. Well, I did once. It was one of those, what do they call them, ambulance chasers. It was a lawyer saying, call now if you've experienced this. And it was clearly one of these jackasses that's trying to take advantage. And so I called it. And I started railing. It was stupid. Why was I wasting my time with this? I started yelling at him. So I have phone rage too, not just road rage. I don't do that anymore though. In any case, he talks about courage as the golden mean. The virtuous mean between excess and deficiency. And I think I discussed this. I mentioned frog and toad to you, about frog or toad, whichever. Saying that courage is what? What did they define courage as? What did that frog say it was? No fear. No fear. That's what courage is? I don't think so. Too easy to come up with counterexamples such as what? Someone who's not afraid, but not courageous. You have an example? Somebody's ignorant of what the dangers are. If I have no idea what a lion is and I just walk into a lion's den, hey kitty, whatever it is, I'm not courageous, I'm just stupid. I think I gave the example of attacking a military encampment or whatever, and all I am armed with is my marker or something. That's not impressive. That's not courageous, right? That's foolhardy, or he'll call it rashness. A limit to little courage, you call that cowardice. And I think we talked about that briefly. The shooting in Parkland. There was a trained officer of the law who was armed at the Parkland shooting incident, but didn't go in to confront the shooter. Do you remember that? Some argue that's cowardice. He's trained, that's his job. He should have gone in to help. He's the first responder, but he didn't respond. I don't know enough of the details to say whether or not that is the case, that he was a coward. Maybe he thought the shooter was still outside. I think that was one of his claims. That was countered by others, but nevertheless, that might be an instance of cowardice on Aristotle's understanding. Notice the golden mean is not going to be exactly the same for everyone. If it was me, instead of that armed, trained first responder, if it's just me, and I didn't go into the building where I heard gunshots, am I a coward? I'm a philosophy professor. If there was a battle going on inside, a battle of one guy wielding Occam's razor and the other one saying, this is a categorical syllogism, then I could step in and say, that's invalid, or whatever. But most fights don't go that way, sadly. They're not battles of arguments in that way. So it would not be an act of courage for the officer to go. Well, it could still be courageous, but it'd be cowardice if he doesn't go in. And I think that's what Aristotle is trying to point out, that this idea of courage, for instance, is a golden mean, this middle between excess and deficiency. And then we can imagine Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, responding, impressive. See how he's saying, It's hard to find those pictures to get them just right. It's an impressive chart, but you're assuming that there's a human nature. This takes us back to George Yancey's use of existentialist motifs. That's wrong. There isn't a human nature. You are not born into the world already programmed, so to speak, with an essence. In the way that this marker, however, is. This marker has a designer. It has a maker. It has an essence. And its essence precedes its existence. Your essence does not. You do not, in fact, have an essence, a purpose of being, a meaning, and so forth, until you first exist and then can make choices. You are the sum total of all of your choices, which is actually a phrase I just heard in an advertisement for some show on HBO or something. Borrowing, if you want, stealing from straight out of Jean-Paul Sartre. You are the sum you're the sum total of your choices. Your essence is defined by you. You are a process. You are a project. If I assume your essence before you're born, that's what Yancey calls out racial stereotypes as doing. Presuming a kind of essence that is outside of your control. It's beyond you. You're born into this group, this category. You are essentially whatever that categorical stereotype is. Your essence precedes your existence. But for Jean-Paul Sartre, that is absurd. And we saw this image before. It is as absurd to think you have an essence before you exist as it is that you should pay your parking fee before existing. I like to think that they hired somebody to make this sign, and the guy was just, or whoever it was disgruntled and wanted to get at him subtly. So yeah, I'll make your damn sign. And then puts an S instead of leaving it out, you see? It's a disgruntled existentialist. Please pay your parking fee before existing. Yeah, I can't do that. Can't do it. Then Jean-Paul Sartre says this: man is a project. He is what he wills. He is not a cauliflower. He actually said that. He said man is not a cauliflower. To which I suspect you would say, yeah, that's so true. We're not cauliflowers. Write that down. You're not a cauliflower. Don't let anyone tell you different. Somebody calls you. Why does that sound absurd? Well, his point is we are not like markers. We are not artifacts. We are not resources. We are not defined prior to our choices. Put another way, we do not have an essence given to us in the way that we give this marker an essence before it even exists. As we'll see in a moment, Sartre will argue there is no God to give us the essence. We are like gods to the marker. Before the marker even exists, I have an understanding of what it's going to be and what would make a good marker, one that writes well or something like that. And then Aristotle responds, whoa, Sartre, whoa. It's a straw man. You're misrepresenting my position. You think I don't know that humans aren't cauliflowers? Of course I do. In fact, then he goes on. He gets interrupted by Sartre, who again, he's saying, okay, fair enough, but where is human liberty on your view? Where's your concept of freedom? I see that you have this concept of virtue. Where is the individual's responsibility? On my view, Sartre says, we're condemned to be free. And I don't recall if I touched on that last time.
That was like right where you left off.
Yeah, I think we stopped here. What does it mean to be condemned to be free? Because that sounds it sounds positive. We're free, and then condemned sounds terrible. How can I be condemned to something that's great? The hell does that mean? We're responsible for our choices. Yes. Why is that a problem?
Because any bad thing that we do or anything that bad happens to us is ultimately our fault.
That's right. We are fully responsible. He would be considered a libertarian on the metaphysical view of freedom. And he later tampers his view a little bit, but we are condemned to be free. And that freedom is both part of what a human being is, but it's our very nature that, in that sense, if I can use the word nature, that kind of, he wouldn't like that. But it is our nature to be free, I guess you could say, and our choices that make us who and what we are. And we have a lot of that makes us feel good. Yay, we're alone, we're finally away from our parents or whatever. Now I'm free. Oh, I got to go to the grocery store or whatever. I should have found a picture of me at the grocery store looking at the cheese aisle. Did I mention the cheese aisle to you last time? Have you ever been to the cheese aisles of like a Costco and you've been tasked with buying, hey, go get some cheese. Okay. And there are the cheese aisles and you're paranoid because you don't know what to do. Maybe you're not paranoid, but you're paralyzed. You don't know what to get. How many different kinds of cheeses do there need to be? And I used to live in northern Illinois, right by Wisconsin border. You think there's a lot of cheese here? Oh my God. Wisconsin is made of cheese, ultimately. You go to the cheese aisles and you have no idea what to do. You are it's a minimal choice, but still, that little bit is paralyzing. We kind of like the idea that choices can be made for us. I don't like to have to make a choice, even if it's simple. What do you want to watch tonight? Oh, damn it, I don't know. You take the remote. I hate having to be responsible for that choice. I have to choose the movie? Let's go through it. What if it's a bad movie? We're going to watch the whole thing? Well, yeah, we paid for it. We're going to watch the whole damn thing. We made this choice. We're responsible for it. He goes on. This is Sartre again. These are actual quotes from him. I'm trying to sort of into a conversation with Aristotle. There is no human nature because there is no God to have a conception of it. In the way that there are humans that make a conception of what their artifacts are. We cannot escape from our complete and profound responsibility, and here you get back to that anxiety. I'm not just free to make choices about me in my life, but I need to be aware that my choices have moral implications. They affect other people. If they only affected me, there would be far less moral concern, far less, if you want, existential anxiety and dread. This is one of the reasons why, from an existentialist therapeutic approach, many people seek out self-help gurus and gurus who tell them, follow me. Notice the word, follow me. I'll help you make the decisions. You don't like making decisions, I'll make the decisions for you. And of course, in many cases, that leads to disaster. But Aristotle responds, wait a minute, to entrust to chance what is greatest and most noble would be a very defective arrangement. In other words, I'm not discounting human freedom. I'm certainly not saying that we just follow the whims of fate or fancy. In fact, it's essential that we act. Choice is italicized here. Remember, virtue is a state of character concerned with choice. It isn't just simply following fate. It isn't simply not having anything to do with your own responsibility. This is a youthful Aristotle here. Again, the state of character concerned with choice lying in a mean. That's the golden mean he's talking about. You are responsible for those choices. To which Sartre, whose left eye now, I think it was his right eye in previous images, now almost left the screen. So each individual is the arbiter of this golden mean. If one is a coward, then he's responsible for his cowardice, as Sartre famously puts it. And Aristotle responds, of course, but our model for finding this mean, finding this virtue, whether it's having to do with courage, wittiness, gratitude, compassion, whatever virtue we want, the model or exemplar is the man of practical wisdom. And that's a phrase he uses to reference the kind of phrase we would speak of with what would Jesus do? Who's the model? Who's the role model, actually, is a way of trivializing it. Oh, that's not terribly trivial, really. Socrates is a role model. Pericles, for Aristotle, was a role model. What would they do in these situations? What kind of virtues do they have? What is their moral character? Can we model that behavior for ourselves? To which Sartre would respond, that's bad faith, which is a technical term, the translation of which is usually self-deception. How is that how am I lying to myself, to the extent that that's possible? The peculiar character of human reality is that it is without excuse. That goes back to our freedom. To deny your freedom in some area, some element, is to make an excuse. It's just my nature. Who's it? Popeye. Is that who said, I am what I am?
Yeah.
Why did he say that? And when did he? What was the context in which Popeye said this?
When he was about to eat spinach?
When he was about to eat spinach. You have to be more specific. He, on multiple occasions, ate spinach. Maybe he ate too much spinach, and that's why his arms and legs look like that. Is it South Park? He finally went to a doctor, and the doctor said, you shouldn't look like this. This is terribly unhealthy. You have diabetes and 10 other diseases. You need to stop eating spinach. I don't know what episode that was. Why does he say, I am what I am? When do you say that? It is what it is. I am what I am. What do you mean when you say that?
Avoiding responsibility.
Exactly. What can I do? We don't intend it to mean that, but Sartre certainly thinks so. You're taking away your responsibility. You're lying to yourself. You're saying, I'm not fully free. I'm just this, that, or the other. I'm just made this way. No. That takes away your burden of responsibility. And we don't like the burden, and we call it a burden. So we put it off. We looked at bad faith. We looked at self-deception when I discussed George Yancey's this article on racism. And I looked at Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist from the 1860s, who was a slave and then a freed slave and then fought to end slavery. He famously argued, and I'll come back to him in a moment when we look at Maria Lugones. He actually has something to say there. He famously argued that there's an obvious inconsistency with slavery. And I think I mentioned this before. The slave owners are lying to themselves. What Jean-Paul Sartre would call bad faith. Self-deception. How so? On the one hand, they have a law that explicitly precludes slaves from learning how to read. And on the other hand, they have laws telling us we can enslave these people because they're not actually people. They're not actually fully human. They're not rational. If they're not rational, then why would you have laws precluding them from being able to read? The assumption that they can read, if taught, as all humans can, if taught, implies that they are rational. You are lying to yourself when you treat them as less than human. You are saying they're not really human just to make yourself feel good. that is self-deception. In this context, he's saying, anytime you presume yourself to have a nature that's not your doing, it is a form of bad faith. It is a form of lying to yourself. It is shirking responsibility, to which Aristotle explodes and shoots out all sides of his mouth. Following the examples of others is not enough. Remember the model. Of course, our model for finding this meaning is the man of practical wisdom. Sartre is calling that bad faith because he's saying, you're just doing what Aristotle would do, or what Socrates would do, or what Jesus would do. That takes away your responsibility. Instead of you making a choice, you're saying, oh, I'm just going to mimic this person. That takes away your freedom in a way that's saying, and your responsibility, in a way that's saying, well, this is what they would do. I'm just following that exemplar. It's not my fault that I did what Socrates would have done in the same situation. He thinks that that's bad faith. Aristotle, I think, would respond, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. This is why reason is so important for each person. I'm not saying just follow a model, just do whatever Socrates does without thinking. That's not what I'm saying. It requires thought. It requires, in fact, he'll use the word contemplation. And this is significant. Somebody getting slapped? That sounded like somebody getting slapped. Did it not?
Or someone slapping something.
Probably that. Let's go with that. I don't want to feel responsible enough to go stop that from happening. Stop slapping that clay. It's clay. It's probably clay. It's molding clay. That's what it is. It's an art class over there. What was I doing? What was I doing? Contemplate. Yeah. Okay. Let me do that. Let me do that individually and by myself, quietly. And you do it too. You all contemplate. Okay? That's what happiness must be a form of contemplation. The whole 9 books of the Nicomachean Ethics, the selection you have for today, is all about, and I may have touched on this before, practical wisdom. How can I behave? How can I habituate myself with respect to virtues and behaving around other people? Social endeavor. How can I improve my lot with friends? What counts as a friend? What counts as courage around other people in danger and so forth? All of this seems to be all very practical and oriented towards social endeavors. And then the last book, book 10, he jumps on this view of contemplation. And philosophers of Aristotelian philosophers have tried to make sense of this seeming contradiction. Is it contemplation? Man thinking alone, to which Sartre thinks is absurd. Contemplation? It's French, so it's my God. Mon Dieu. This is what determines the good life, is just solitary individual in thought.
Is that from Das Book Zarathustra?
The image is used. The original painting was not made for Nietzsche, but there are copies of Thus Spake Zarathustra, which we'll cover next semester in Contemporary Philosophy. That's right. So we'll hear a lot about Nietzsche in that class. But if you remember from the beginning of the semester, one of our concerns, one of the attacks against philosophy, is that it's just contemplation. It's just, if you want, represented in Rodin's The Thinker, the philosopher who's just thinking deep in thought. Yeah. For some reason totally naked. Just pondering things. And that's fine. And Sartre's question is implied here, unless this is what you're thinking about. And unless that's all you're doing is thinking. If all you're doing is contemplation, and you're not doing anything, then there is a critique against philosophy generally. And it seems that Aristotle, on the one hand, is pushing this view. We are most divine, we are most at our best, we are most human, most rational when we're in contemplation. But if that's all we're doing, as Sartre puts out, then we're lacking in something, in particular our moral sense. Man is no other than a series of his undertakings. The sum, notice the word actions is underlined, the sum of our actions. We are the combination of all of our choices. If you're interested in existential motifs in movies, I highly suggest Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors, which ends, and it covers a lot of the things we deal with in this class, it ends with a quotation from a philosopher in the film. Woody Allen likes to have philosophers in his film, which is nice. We are the sum total of all of our choices. That is what we are. That's an existentialist motif. And then Karl Marx jumps into the conversation out of nowhere. Remember, this is Sartre and Aristotle just talking. And then boom, where's Marx? He just jumps in. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. He's right about the point to change it. He's wrong to think that philosophers have only interpreted it. He's mistaken about that. And then you look at the history of philosophy, in which many philosophers have written their works from prison, implying that they were doing more than just thinking about it, just interpreting it. They were doing things in the world and attempting to change it. And Marx is very much influential on Sartre for a number of reasons. But Aristotle would agree. He says, I agree, Marx. Now get the hell out of our conversation. Just and brave acts and other virtuous acts we do in relation to each other. No one would choose to live without friends. Granted, that's not explicitly an obvious response to what Marx said, but I'm trying to keep as close to their actual comments as possible, sort of shoehorning them, or whatever that word is, into what would be a dialogue. No one would choose to live without friends. In other words, it isn't merely a matter of contemplation. A meaningful life involves other people. And in fact, we see this today. Psychologists have now, it's taken a while for them to come up with this, to give data, that after longitudinal studies, we discover it isn't money, it isn't fame, it isn't happiness, it isn't fortunes and so forth, and successes that establishes and creates a sense of well-being, a flow experience, or what Aristotle would call eudaimonia, a flourishing experience. It's actually friends. That's the primary contributor to one's happiness or eudaimonia and flourishing is friends. And Aristotle was aware of at least that as a large part of it. Not friends on Facebook, necessarily. That you have 150 friends or whatever. That's not exactly what he's talking about. Aristotle thought you shouldn't even have cities larger than 140,000 people. That's too large, really, for direct democracy and for communication and friendship, as it were. In any case, this conversation ends with Sartre walking off, saying, "Good talk, Ari. Thanks, Ari." That's Aristotle. I'm off to meet Camus. We'll talk about Camus next semester as well. He was a colleague, a friend of Sartre's for at least a little bit, and they got into some squabbles. And then Aristotle's waving. See, okay, bye. I'm late for my lesson with Alex. Who's Alex?
Great.
Alexander the Great. But Aristotle's not going to call him that. He's going to say, "Hey, Alexander the Great, it's time for your lessons." He called him Alex, obviously. Pretty sure. And so they part ways, but I want to leave you with some similarities. Don't need to write these down, but they're posted for you. Here are some similarities that both Aristotle, I think, and Sartre would agree, even though there's such different viewpoints with respect to human nature. Sartre doesn't really think there is a human nature. To the extent that there is, it's total freedom, which isn't something that you can pinpoint. Whereas Aristotle thinks that we do have an end, a telos, and it's rationality, right? And we talked about that. Humans aren't cauliflowers. Both agree. No problem there. A minimum degree of physical well-being is necessary. Money is necessary. Food's necessary. Both agree with that, but that's not what establishes happiness and flourishing. There are subjective and objective elements to morality. We can be mistaken about what a good life is for ourselves. We don't know necessarily where that golden mean is, but we can be mistaken if we think we're doing the best for ourselves if we're just sitting around snorting cocaine or whatever. We are mistaken about what our human good is. You can be wrong about that. Living out our long-term goals, aligning them with habitual action is necessary. We talked about that with a response to implicit biases, with a response to good parenting. I want to make that a habitual act. Self-interest, not selfishness, and concern and commitment to others is necessary, and social relations are beneficial for a good life. Talk about that. Flourishing, or eudaimonia, and authenticity. That's the term that Sartre will use. That's very important for him. We didn't actually get into that. These are fragile and can be upset at any time, and you're never done actually seeking them out. Which connects to the last point. One has never completed the good life. It is a process. I think Aristotle would agree with Sartre with respect to this constant building. The good life is no more completed or achievable than completing your education. You don't ever actually stop learning, just as you're never done ultimately developing yourself. And I think there's agreement at the end here. Now, related to this, well, there's a lot more we can say about this. I want to stop here so we have time to get to the Lugones article. But are there any questions about how this dialogue went? I don't know if they would really have said these things. Maybe Aristotle would have discounted Sartre off the face of it for not being Greek. The time that Aristotle wrote, anyone who is not Greek, they were really arrogant about it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk to you. I don't even understand you. This is, by the way, where the word barbarian comes from. Because you non-Greeks, I don't get it. It's all bar to us. And that's why they were called barbarians, which is non-Greeks, bless you. Which is ironic, because what do we say today? I don't get that. I don't understand it. It's all Greek to me, huh? I think that's clever. I think that's interesting. And yet the word barbarian comes from that. So I don't know what they would actually say to each other, but my best guess is what I just gave you, and I'm going to stick with it. At least with respect to the good life, okay? Now, this transition is sort of transitioning back to the reading before Aristotle. I've struggled the order to which I should put these. I keep Lugones here, the reading here, because it transitions so nicely into the last discussion we have on humor, which I hope to talk about briefly today, at least introducing it, when she talks about playfulness. But it also takes us back to a connection with the end of George Yancey's article in the elevator. You'll see the language is very similar. Lugones' article is written in 1987, and Yancey's in 2008. But both are appealing to similar traditions. We already saw that Yancey's appealing to existentialist literature and something called phenomenology, which is a first-person attempts at first-person accounts of experience and consciousness. And Lugones does the same thing with story, with autobiographical data. Now, I told you to start reading where it gets to world traveling, which is about 3 or 4 pages into the article today. But there's some interesting autobiographical stuff at the beginning, which I hope you did get a chance to read. That's a common strategy or tactic of existentialist philosophers that's not found in traditional philosophy. You'll find dialogues where there's conversations, but it's rare that you find full-blown novels or plays. And you do find that Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a number of novels and plays in addition to his philosophical argumentative work. And I think it's significant. It's in the traditional Western philosophical view, it's argument supporting our position. I don't want to give, and the argument should stand or fall on the basis and merits of the logical connectedness of the premises used. It shouldn't matter who is making the case. This gets questioned in a way by the phenomenological and existentialist approaches, where novels, where stories, where first-person accounts are seen as part of the argument, and in fact are seen as ways of making a point that doesn't appeal directly to logic and argumentation. And I think when we look at world traveling and understand what that means from Lugones' sense, we'll see that it connects a little bit with what Yancey was dealing with at the very end of the paper you had, where he talked about racism in elevators. What if argument does not work in getting others to see your point of view? What if argument, what if reason, what if logic, what if facts by themselves, or even put in the form of a syllogism, don't work? Are there alternatives? And Yancey, I think, anticipates this. He says, the very last page of the reading from last time, he says, or from 2 times ago, hence being, so we're to imagine a sort of thought experiment. Let's imagine in the elevator, instead of us just getting off and parting ways, the white woman on the elevator who was engaging in implicit biases, bodily comportment that seemed to imply Yancey himself was dangerous, was already guilty, so to speak. If instead of leaving, the elevator breaks down, let's imagine that scenario. Hence, being confined within the elevator, this provides an opportunity to have her identity challenged, cracked, and rendered ambiguous, a form of uncertainty that begins to expand her sense of interpersonal possibilities and moral imagination. He doesn't reference Lugones in his paper, but the language is so obviously connected. And I'm not saying that he's borrowing from her at all, but the similar traditions he's borrowing from. This idea of having our identity cracked and challenged and rendered ambiguous in a way that forces us away from stereotypical thinking, that hates ambiguity, that hates plurality. We like things pure in our categories. It's either this or that. You're either one thing or the other. You're either with us or with us or you're against us. That kind of constructed and fabricated dichotomy is comforting. And it's easier to interact, it's easier to feel at ease, phrase that Lugones will use, if we have this presumed certainty about other people and about ourselves. Yancey's point here is that perhaps in this situation, one is going to be inclined to actually question their own sense of who they are and why they perceive others the way that they do. Because then you start talking. You start talking about similarities. Oh, it turns out we both have a fear of elevators. We both have a fear of small places. We both have a fear of flying. We both have kids and so forth. That seems so minimal and trivial. But Yancey's point is that in finding some way to, in Lugones' point, travel across worlds, which I'll define in a moment, or in Yancey's terms, tarry along with the other person's perspective, you're much more likely to engage with them as if they were human. And you see this in so many different facets of life today. In politics, I'm not going to listen to what a conservative has or what a liberal has if I'm on the other side of the political spectrum, unless I know somebody and respect that person. I'm not going to dismiss their viewpoint as absurd and stupid and silly, as if they're arguing for the flat earth scenario. If I know them and understand them and recognize that their motives are coming to truth. They want to know what the truth is. And I recognize that because I know them. You can see it in other cases too. And oftentimes just telling people who may be on the opposite end of the political spectrum or moral spectrum or whatever it may be, trying to convince them, you're mistaken, here's why, doesn't work. We know that with psychology today. It's really hard to convince somebody about something that they feel certain. Giving them facts actually sometimes doesn't help. It makes them get more entrenched in their worldview. If you think that if you want to convince somebody that global climate change is actually happening, forget about whether it's caused by humans or not, but just that it's happening, it's really hard sometimes to just say, look at all the evidence, look at all the data. Doing that is seen almost as an affront to the intelligence of the other person, and they actually dig in more and don't listen to what you have to say. You can see it in moral situations too. Sometimes it takes the story of a person you know or can come to know that can open you up, that can crack you, so to speak, to recognize the complexities of other people. And you can see this with the same-sex debate, same-sex marriage. It was assumed for so many people, and only like 15 years ago, things changed rapidly, very quickly on that score. And that's a fascinating study as to why that is. Let's say 50 years ago, people didn't come out. They were afraid. And so people wouldn't know. We might say, I don't think gay people should get married. I think homosexuality itself is a horrible thing. And there are arguments for or against that. I'm not going to deal with that now. The point from the perspective of those arguing for gay rights is that the success, one of the successes, one of the means of success, was showing, look, you know people who are gay. And once you recognize that, it changes fundamentally your approach to that issue. Dick Cheney, who was vehemently against same-sex marriage, when he discovered that his daughter was gay, that changed his worldview. Now, that doesn't mean, now he's a morally good person because he changed his view on that matter. Then perhaps he should have done it prior to having somebody in his family. The point being, if we can't change somebody's mind by showing, here's somebody that you care about who has this view, we have to find some way of crossing worlds to make the stories accessible. And sometimes argument isn't the way to do it. And here, this is kind of hard for me to say because I teach philosophy, and the main goal of the main tool of philosophy is argumentation. But there are some cases in which it's just absurd to rely on argument. As Frederick Douglass points out in his 5th of July speech, I've referenced him before. Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist, he wrote a speech on the 5th of July after the celebration of the 4th of July, which is a celebration of America and how great it is. You can imagine why he might disagree in 1852, why America wasn't so great for everyone. He says, "Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his body? Well, you've already declared it." And he uses the word declare there on purpose. Where is the declaration of this? You have it there. You've already declared it. You've already stated it. It's part of your ideals. It's written into the construction of the very nation. Why would I need to argue for that which is already explicitly declared? Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There's not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. And at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Scorching irony. This is the kind of what I would call subversive humor, which doesn't rely upon direct argumentation. It relies upon what we might call very short thought experiments, if you want, that could be backed up by argument. Of course, there are arguments in justification of what Frederick Douglass is saying. But it seems almost absurd to make such an argument. Similar to our examples before, where we looked at the question-begging argument that it's wrong to poke puppies in the eyes because they have souls. It sounds absurd to even start with premises justifying the claim that you ought not poke puppies in the eyes. He's saying something even more obvious, that you ought not enslave another human being. This doesn't require argument. In fact, it's absurd. We're beyond the point of needing to argue for this. It is an argument. It's and I don't want to be cautious here. It's irony of the sort that what's his name? Oh my goodness. Modest Proposal. Jonathan Swift engages in with this Modest Proposal. And I want to make the connection between this approach, this humorous approach, this playfulness, even in the midst of something as horrible as slavery. Because you see it in the Holocaust as well, and that's something that I referenced last time with Viktor Frankl, where humor is seen as a means of resistance, but also a means of maintaining one's sense of humanity in the worst situation. As Douglass points out in his autobiographies, I have been greatly helped to bear up under unfriendly conditions too by a constitutional tendency to see the funny side of things. And on a multitude of occasions. It doesn't seem like he had a sense of humor. Look at him, he's so serious. But everyone looked like that in pictures back then because it took so long for the picture to be, you didn't sit there and smile for 5 minutes because we don't know when it's going to happen. So you just stood there and made a face. I think that's probably why most people frowned. But even in the midst of something as horrible as slavery, he invokes humor as a means to disarm, in many cases, otherwise adversarial audiences. And in some cases, it's used as a mode of resistance. Now, there's a kind of irony here that slaves would engage in a kind of subtle code that was also humorous for them. The slave owners didn't get it. In fact, they didn't get it so much so that when they engaged in what's called blackface, where the white actors paint their faces and act out the stereotypical behaviors of slaves. They did this during the Jim Crow era, and in fact, up at Cal Poly, apparently it's still being done. I don't know if you heard that. Fraternity engaging in that behavior. Likely the fraternity has no idea about the history of this, but maybe they do. There's an irony, however, with blackface, with the covering up of one's skin and pretending to be and fit out the stereotypes of what slaves were. The irony is that the slaves knew that they were being mocked, and the slaves were in fact acting in ways that was pretending to be like the white owners. They were mocking their behavior that was being copied by the white actors. The behavior was in fact mockery of the white owners. And so when actors pretended to be black, making fun of the slaves, they were actually making fun of themselves, unbeknownst to themselves. It's a deep irony that Mel Watkins discusses in his book, History of Comedy from Slavery to Chris Rock, which is a fascinating text. Once you learn of that, that gives you a bit more understanding of the role that humor might play. Now, to what extent does humor potentially play, what role does it play with respect to Maria Lugones' understanding of playfully crossing borders, as she puts it, of world travel, We have to make sense of what she means by a world, what she means by traveling, and what she means by playful. And I'm going to focus on all of those, but spend most of the time on playful because it connects most with our discussion of humor in a little bit. So how to see oneself and others is part of what she's getting at. Now, she's a philosopher from Argentina. She starts with a discussion about her background with her mother and how she failed to recognize or see herself in her mother, how she failed to recognize, if you want, the complexity of her mother's existence, of who she was. There are multiple senses of identity. And that's the beginning point of her discussion of this world traveling. She describes it from her own standpoint in the way that Yancey does in the elevator with his lived experience. She does the same thing with respect to her experiences and existence in the Anglo world, as it were, where she recognizes how she's perceived, she sees how others see her, and she recognizes how she sees herself in that world. But one doesn't belong to just a single world. There are worlds that we construct for ourselves, our identities in the existentialist sense, but there are also worlds we inhabit that are constructed by others, that we may or may not agree to, may or may not like. So what does she mean by world? It's a concept that she borrows not from philosophical thought experiments like possible worlds. She wants to distinguish her conception of world from that. A possible world is where you can write a fiction about time travel or something like that, where there's not the actual possibility of it. She wants to talk about flesh and blood worlds, or worlds inhabited by flesh and blood people. That's what she's focusing on. So there are lived spaces of an individual, and there's a lot more to it. She leaves it kind of an open concept, and that's important. But for the most part, we can get a sense of a world from her perspective here. The lived spaces of an individual, cultural representations, communities, individual constructs, permeable, interconnected, and interdependent spheres. These are always incomplete and always becoming. Just as you are members of multiple cultures. We talked about that with relativism and the problems of relativism. You don't belong to just a single culture. And how we define culture is oftentimes somewhat vague, somewhat fuzzy. I think she's employing that same kind of thinking with respect to a world. And this will tie us to this concept of world, connects with a lot of what George Yancey, borrowing from W.E.B. Du Bois, and concept of double consciousness discusses. Lugones coins this phrase, ontological confusion. It's a great phrase. Onto meaning being, right? Our essence, if you want, our being, our nature, so to speak. In this case, maybe our identity, ourselves, is ambiguous. Remember, Yancey uses this term ambiguous. It's a recognition that you are not a simple, single-dimensional, so to speak, entity. As you know, humans are the most complex entities in the known universe. And we have our own concept of self. In addition to the way that we see others. In addition to the way that others see us. And here we find a parallel with what we discussed before with double consciousness. This is in the negative sense, as W.E.B. Du Bois uses double consciousness. Lugones uses double image of myself. It's clearly a connected notion. I don't recall her referencing Du Bois in her reading in the paper you had, but there's a clear connection. For Du Bois, the double consciousness was a recognition of how he sees himself and a maintaining of that perception. At the same time, he sees how others see him, which she says is also a positive. Because if I'm living on the borders of society, so to speak, if I'm part of the marginalized group that's been historically oppressed, I am forced to see differently. I'm forced to see more broadly. I, in that way, have an epistemic privilege because of my social lack or because of my lack in social privilege. Yancey is able to recognize oppression in instances in which others don't. And this is to be expected. Because as she puts it herself, it's oftentimes a matter of survival that those on the margins of society both understand and see as those in power see, and see from their own perspective. Whereas those who are in power, or are in part are parts of or members of a privileged group do not have to see differently. They don't have to consider alternative points of view. It isn't necessary to imagine what it is like for the police officer to perceive me. But Chris Rock tells us he's got to tell his kids, his very young children, you need to be very much aware of how you are perceived by other people. So you're seeing yourself through your own perception and how you construct yourself, in Lugones' term. But you're also seeing how others perceive you. That's a skill. It opens you up to interpreting and understanding other people. And in a way, and this will tie in with comedy, with humor, comedians are actually very good at doing this. It's not coincidental that for most of the 20th century, a lot of comedians come from marginalized areas of society, partly because they're already prone toward seeing the absurdity in life. They're like anthropologists who are part of a society and yet able to step outside of it and make us see it as if it were alien, make us see our own culture as if it were strange and unique, which is what anthropologists do when we study other cultures. What's interesting about comedians is they're able to show us something that's mundane but make it seem strange to us, so that we sort of hold a mirror up to what our society is like. Now, comedians can do that through practice and training and writing and so forth, and I'll explain how that works later. But those on the margins of society are doing this because it's a matter of survival. They have to be able to see from multiple perspectives. And world traveling is an attempt to get others to facilitate this, to hone this perceiving, to practice it, such that traveling is something that's possible. But you have to be able to do it in a way that implies travel, not as a tourist, but travel in a playful sense. And I don't want to get too much into the details of this, but a traveler, and she does this a little bit, I don't remember the page, a traveler is genuinely interested in the identity of others. A tourist isn't really concerned with that. The tourist is concerned with pleasure, with commodifying the society, the culture in which they are touring, absorbing that community, maybe even commodifying it in such a way that they can benefit from it. This is not world traveling in the sorts that Lugones is interested in. World traveling for her is not touring, it's not a tourist. It's a kind of playful activity of, well, in fact, let me, I think I have an example of it, in contrast to Columbusing, which is a phrase that wasn't around at the time of Lugones. But has anyone heard of Columbusing? What is that? Yeah.
It's kind of having a roadmap in front of you, thinking that, this is where I'm going, and not really. Basically, when Columbus went, he's going, I found a faster way over to India.
Uh-huh.
He comes over, ends up in America, and assumes it's India.
And he calls the inhabitants Indians.
He calls them Indians and kind of just
and says,
assumes his culture onto it.
There you go. That's part of it. Louis C.K. has a nice bit about this. Columbus thinks he's at India, and it's not India at all. And he sees the natives there, and he says, you guys, this is India. You guys are Indians, right? It's like, no, we're not Indians. Yeah, you are. No, we're a whole other people. No, you're Indians. We're going to keep calling you Indians for hundreds of years because we don't give a shit. That's Columbusing, and that's also something that's called ontological expansiveness. All areas, all places, all time periods are open to us. We expand our being, so to speak, that makes them all forcibly ours, so to speak. You know what? Maybe it doesn't hurt to get at a brief discussion of that via this. I don't know if it'll come up. 1 second here. Let me just give you, if you're not familiar with Columbusing, let's just watch this brief video and see. This is a skit. It's not an actual conversation. So just pay attention. See if this makes sense of Columbusing.
Dude, thanks for meeting me here, man. No problem, I love this place. Yeah, I just discovered it.
You didn't discover it. I come here all the time.
Sure I did.
No, people have been here before you, so you didn't discover it.
Oh, yes, sorry. I didn't discover it.
Right.
Columbus did.
You what?
I Columbused it. I discovered it for white people.
You can't discover someplace that people have already been to first.
Yes, I can. That's exactly what Columbus did. Columbus America, and I Columbus this bar. Oh, hey guys, what's up?
Who are they?
White people. I told everyone I know about this cool new bar.
Dude, this place is not new, okay? It's been here since 1935. It's on the wall.
But it was Columbus in 2014.
Just unearthed a hidden gem. Hashtag Columbus. Hashtag I discovered Bed-Stuy. Dude, my parents live in Bed-Stuy. You did not discover Bed-Stuy. You can't say that.
Look, Columbusing is just a part of life. Like, for example, off the top of your head, who twerks?
Miley Cyrus.
Shit. See, Miley Cyrus Columbus twerking.
Yeah, but that's not fair because the Yin Yang Twins had a song about twerking like 14 years ago.
Nobody said Columbusing was fair. I mean, just ask the Native Americans. Or Mary Lambert, the lesbian songwriter whose gay rights anthem didn't get popular until it was remixed by a straight dude. Macklemore, Columbus, same-sex marriage, just like Gwyneth Paltrow, Columbus, Eastern medicine, College humor, Columbus, basic bitches,
And sublime Columbus reggae. I get it. Is there such thing as reverse Columbusing? Could somebody Columbus something from white culture?
It's impossible. White people are too good at taking credit for stuff.
What if I Columbus hummus?
Already Columbus from the Middle East by health-conscious whiteys.
Zumba class.
Columbus from Colombia by every white mom.
Boat shoes.
Practically moccasins, which we Columbus from the Native Americans, among other things.
What if I Columbus peacoats?
Well, you can't Columbus peacoats because you can't.
Yes, I can.
You can't.
I Columbus
You can't
peacoats.
because it's not fair. I've been wearing peacoats since long before I
Hey
discovered
guys, how
Bed-Stuy.
about we try this brand new trend?
Not you.
Come on, let's go to the outlets.
No one go to the outlets. Don't check.
All right, so there's a sense of what Columbusing is. That's college humor. It's the way. Well, there's an example of humor again, as perhaps a means of. We'll talk about this in more detail of raising consciousness about a particular issue in a way that straightforward protests or arguments may fail, which is another element for discussion. So I think that's kind of in the background of what she's talking about with the distinction between touring and world traveling. Because the world, a traveler, somebody who's interested in other worlds, so to speak, is not interested in mere comfort. When you're touring, you want comfort. She calls it maximal ease. And there's a Nietzsche, we just discussed Nietzsche a moment ago, he has a phrase called miserable ease, which is a kind of complacency. This is part of what she's concerned about. And notice the motif throughout the semester. This maximal way of being at ease is somewhat dangerous because it tends to produce people who have no inclination to travel across worlds or have no experience of world traveling. It's similar to the concern that Bertrand Russell had with respect to certainty. The goal of philosophy is to dissipate certainty, right? Of ignorance, which he calls skepticism, and of knowledge, which he calls dogmatism. And it's the dogmatism that's dangerous. That presumption of certainty, that feeling of certitude, leads to complacency. It leads to the disinclination to see differently. I don't need to see as other people see. I've had no need to do so. Does this perspective matter? The perspective from which I come is the only one that matters. I've not been forced to see from any other perspective but my own. But those who are on the margins of society, in the interest of survival, in fact have to. Part of what she's trying to say is, how can we get people to travel across worlds without forcing them to be marginalized themselves? And it's too much, I think, to ask for people who are part of a privileged group to change their appearance, as John Howard Griffin did in Black Like Me. That's asking too much. Not everyone should have to do that just to experience what it is like to be part of a marginalized group. But that's a kind of world traveling that John Howard Griffin went through. And he he briefly, that takes away a little bit of legitimacy because he can easily change, what it is like to be oppressed. What she's trying to get at is a way of world traveling that doesn't require oppressing another group of people just so that they can see what it is like to have a different perspective. Because in a failure to see this, a failure to see others in this way, leads to, as she puts it, marginalized people being ignored, being ostracized, being invisible, stereotyped, left completely alone, interpreted as crazy, and so on. You don't typically jump to those conclusions, and you don't treat others that way when you have some understanding of who they are. Back to our discussion of, Dick Cheney and his daughter, for instance. It changes the way you respond once you have a connection to them. which is not necessarily based, in fact, it's not based in logical argumentation, which tells us that maybe there's a limit to argumentation. Even though there may be arguments behind all the things that she's saying, she's advocating for a kind of playfulness. Not frivolity. The word playful is ambiguous. It has more than one meaning. Her understanding of playful world travel is something that we're going to utilize when we look at playfulness with humor. I think there's a distinction to be made between playfulness and humor that is ridiculing. In fact, I might even make the argument that humor that is engaged, laughter as a result of ridicule and mockery doesn't even constitute humor. We'll see. But playfulness, unruly, open to self-construction and ambiguity, active, creative, and unafraid of uncertainty. Again, this is the beginning point of philosophy, as we've mentioned multiple times. Tension, doubt, a recognition of a gap in your understanding or knowledge. Without that first stage of recognizing you don't know something, philosophy becomes impossible. Why do I need to think about anything at all if I'm certain about it? So the thought is killed by this presumed sense of certainty. She's using the same kind of idea, but with respect to identities, with respect to other people's lived experiences, with respect to hearing and using a term from Friedrich Hegel, recognition. How is it that we come to recognize others in a way that is non-stereotypical, to use our theme throughout up to this point? This playfulness, however, isn't like a common sense notion of play. When you hear the word play, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it me or people getting up and moving all around today in a way that's all right? I don't mean to call you out on it. It seems like more often than ever before. And I lost track of it. Damn it.
What do you think of when you think of playfulness?
Oh, when you hear the word playful. What does it mean to play? What comes to mind when you hear the word play? Yeah?
I think of games.
Games like what?
Like sports.
Sports. I'm the coach of my kids' soccer team, and they play soccer, and they love it. They have fun. But they have rules that they have to follow. And they didn't make the rules. And the rules are inviolable. They can't violable. You can't violate the rules. You can't slide tackle. And
Unless they have like fouls.
That's right. That breaks the rule. Exactly. But her conception of playfulness isn't the same sense as our typical understanding of play, which is kind of let's play a game. And when you're playing a game, the rules are already set and predetermined before you even get in the game. Your goal is to defeat the opponent, and in that sense, playfulness is agonistic. And you see an interesting root. What's the root of agonistic play? Agony, the agony of defeat. When you have playfulness in that sense, there are winners and losers, and more losers than winners. And she sees, from the Western perspective, the history of Western society as being playful in that sense of competition, of defeating opponents, of being agonistic. That is not world traveling that she's interested in, because that kind of agonistic playfulness leads to domination and the destruction of worlds, as history seems to show. Go ahead.
So would her playfulness be more focused on maybe like toying with an idea, or kind of immersing yourself in the world just to experience what it is? Would that be her focus of her playfulness?
Yes, the example she gives, now that I think about it, I like your example maybe better than hers, because she talks about playfulness. This is where I want to be. Did my underlinings help you? I underlined it a lot. Okay. We are playing. The playfulness, let's see. So I'll come to your question in a second. Let's see. What is loving playfulness that I have in mind? Let me begin with an example. We are by the riverbank. The river is very, very low, almost dry, bits of water here and there, little pools, a few trout hiding in the rocks. We walk across the stones for a while. You pick up a stone and crash it onto the others. As it breaks, it's quite wet inside. It's colorful, pretty. I pick up a stone, break it, and run toward the pieces to see the colors. They're beautiful. I laugh, bring the pieces back to you, and you're doing the same with your pieces. We keep crushing the stones for hours. Wow. Anxious to see the beautiful new colors. We are playing. The playfulness of our activity does not presuppose that there is something like crashing stones that is a particular form of play with its own rules. Rather, and this goes to your question, I think, the attitude that carries us through the activity, the playful attitude, turns the activity into play. Our activity has no rules, though it's certainly intentional. It goes on, the playfulness that gives meaning to our activity includes uncertainty. But in this case, the uncertainty is an openness to surprise. When I'm playing with an idea, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In German, we talk about thought experiments. Ernst Mach coins the term thought experiment. I think he coined it. And in German, it's sometimes called Gedankenspiel. And you have to yell it because it's German. Gedankenspiel, which means thought play, right? Are thought experiments serious or are they frivolous?
They can have serious connotations.
Right.
Most of the time you're just playing with an idea.
You're playing with an idea, but it's seriousness. You're playing with serious ideas. Do comedians just joke around? Are they not ever serious? Well, it depends on what you mean by serious and playful. Yeah, they're playing around. Yeah, they're joking around, but they're not just joking. Think of the riddle, which riddles and jokes are very similar. Look at the riddle by the comedian Ellen Cleghorn from the 1980s. She said the following: why is it that when white women are naked, it's pornography, but when black women are naked, it's anthropology? Now, she's joking in the context of a stand-up performance, but she's not just joking, right? It isn't just an attempt to laugh. Actually, that's an interesting question. What makes one pornography? It's offensive to their humanity and autonomy. But if it's black women who are naked, now they're a subject of study. They're an object, not subject, they're an object of study. They're seen as things to be investigated, prodded by scientific, and so forth. That's a huge difference. And that's all in a comedian's bit. And it gets us to think in ways that we might not have otherwise. Yes, she's playing with ideas, and they're surprising ideas. And to the extent that we're in a playful attitude, we're open to this. We're open to this surprise. And this takes us into our discussion of humor. But I want to end, I think there may be one other thing I had to say here. When we travel to others' worlds, we can understand what it is to be them and what it is to be ourselves in their eyes. That's sort of a different way of putting that same point with respect to world traveling. Now the question I have for us is, for instance, can humor play a role in playful world traveling? Wouldn't that be funny? And notice the word funny has a couple of senses. That's funny. When you say that's funny, what do you mean? What's that? It's odd. That's strange. So there's funny ha-ha, and then there's funny huh. And the two can go together. So it's funny ha-ha, huh. Or vice versa. He goes ha ha. But it's not unimportant that the two go together. Because when you find something strange, what do you actually mean? Something doesn't make sense. Something is unclear. There's doubt, there's tension, there's confusion. And that can be driven by another emotion. So you have two emotions here that are at play. Curiosity, strange. And also mirth, that feeling, that enjoyment that you are addicted to of laughter. You put those two together, and I think you have the makings for a very fruitful way of, in Lugones' sense, of world traveling. And I think, we only have 10 minutes, so I can only introduce this. I want to get at least some of this get into some of this before next class, so that we have a little bit of room at the end for any questions you might have about the test. But I think there's some interesting parallels with the Yancey article, when he references Du Bois and double consciousness, and Frederick Douglass and his use of humor against slavery. And Maria Lugones' concept of playful world traveling. The idea that humor can be a tool in the goal of subversion of an unjust status quo, I think is of great importance. And I want to start with a joke that I've used before. I know you've seen it. And use this as a kind of discussion point. I started the semester with this joke, did I not? Yeah, it seems familiar. And I may have said a few things about Socrates here. Let me just expand on what I meant by this. So I like this joke because it's so short. I don't know of any shorter joke than this. Masochist says, hit me. Sadist says, no. When you first read that, it doesn't make sense. It makes no sense at all if you don't know what a masochist or sadist is. That's also important. But like Socrates, who doesn't give you answers, he doesn't say, Euthyphro, you're wrong. That's not what virtue is. That's not what piety is. Here's what it is. You're mistaken. Here's the argument from my position. Instead, Socrates asks questions, and in dialogue fashion, gets you to think and participate. In a dialogue, in a conversation, you have a role to play. And that's true with humor as well. The humorist is only playing part of the role in a conversation. You have to fill in the blanks. And if the humorist fills in the blanks for you, what happens? It's not funny, and you don't get it. You come to understand it, but you don't get it. And here's the key language. It's not trivial. You don't get to see it for yourself. Oh, now I get it. Now I see. If I take away that opportunity for you to get it and take away the surprise, you no longer get the reward of aha. That's the ha-ha. You don't get the ha-ha or the aha. You don't get the revelatory experience, and you don't get the enjoyment. I just suck the humor and the benefits out of the joke from it. Similar to saying somebody's got a crossword puzzle, and then you go finish it for them. They asked for your assistance. They didn't want you to do the whole thing for them. That takes away all the pleasure of succeeding. What do I mean with this joke? If I were to say, imagine a stand-up doing a performance. So a masochist says, oh, by the way, a masochist is somebody who enjoys having pain inflicted upon themselves, okay? You got that? Well, he says, hit me. And then the sadist says, and a sadist is somebody who enjoys inflicting pain on other people. The sadist says, no.
It doesn't add up.
It sucks. And actually, it would be kind of funny if the comedian did that for every joke. Maybe that would be a funny bit, sort of a meta joke, where he explains every single joke he or she gives throughout the whole performance. There's something to that. Anyway, I've taken away your job. You no longer have to recognize, you no longer have to find out, oh, there's a mistake. Because that's one of the arguments I want to make, is that humor results from recognizing an error. From recognizing that I had an expectation and it isn't met. And that's important. We expect a sadist to want to hit the masochist. It makes no sense that the sadist doesn't hit the masochist until you read it again, until you reinterpret it, until you expand your perspective. That's what humorists are supposed to do, the good ones. That's what philosophers are supposed to do. That's what a world traveler does, expand our perspectives to see from a multiplicity of angles. Seeing it one-dimensionally, this sucks. Seeing it one-dimensionally, it makes no sense. If you can oscillate between multiple perspectives, you realize, oh, the sadist is doing something consistent with their essence, if you want. They are hurting the masochist. How? In this case, by not hurting them. Oh, I get it. I see. So one of the conclusions I want to get, and there's a lot there, so let me just introduce it. Bless you. Humorous laughter is a result. Why spend time on this? Because laughter is a weird thing. You look at, imagine a space alien coming down and looking at humans laughing. What the hell's wrong with these creatures? What are they doing? Are they in pain? It doesn't seem like a beneficial trait for survival on the face of it. When I was younger, we went out and steal street signs because we were stupid. And the security guard and police officer was chasing us. And a friend of mine, who's a buffoon, he laughed at everything. His name is Alex. And he fell down laughing. He couldn't stop laughing. He said, Alex, come on, there's the police are right there. He just laughed and laughed. And we left him. What are we going to do, carry him on our shoulders? He wouldn't stop laughing. I said, Alex, you're on your own. And I think we could hear him laughing still as the police said, hey, what are you doing? He just started laughing at him. He couldn't stop. This is not a good survival benefit. If it was out in the wild, the cops were cheetahs or whatever, he'd have been eaten. So what the hell's the benefit of laughter? And I'm most interested in laughter that comes from humor. So the argument here is humorous laughter is a result of the perception and appreciation. There's a lot here. But playful, and in Lugones' sense of playful, non-threatening incongruity which reveals an erroneous committed belief. That is, I believed that something was the case, upon reinterpreting it, I recognize an error, a mistake. An expectation is not met. There's a kind of incongruence or dissonance. Remember the phrase dissonance, cognitive dissonance that Franz Fanon used? I have a belief that I thought was true, but this belief I also thought was true. Now that they're both brought to my conscious attention, I realize they can't both be true at the same time. A good comedian's able to do that, to facilitate and get us to think and be aware of that tension and to, in fact, enjoy it. That's the mirth. We're not going to fix our web of beliefs that may be inconsistent if we don't ever take the time to notice that there are inconsistent beliefs within the web. But since we have this mirth addiction, that was a joke I used at the beginning of the semester, playing off of the similar sounding meth addiction, which is not funny at all. It's horrible. It's terrible. But a mirth addiction, the side effects of mirth addiction are, belly aches on occasion, your cheeks might hurt, releases all sorts of chemicals, that's a positive. It causes social bonding, that's a positive. And the argument here, it reveals an erroneous, otherwise committed belief. It is an error detection device, as I'll argue. It succeeds by lighting up the parts of our brain in our reward centers. It's not a euphemism or a metaphor. We are literally addicted to humor in the way that we're addicted to sugar, in the way that we're addicted to cocaine. It's just that the negative consequences of sugar and cocaine are way worse than laughter. The parts of our brain that light up when we get a drug fix, the reward centers of our brain, overlap with the parts of our brain that light up when we enjoy humorous laughter. Reward centers of the brain. I have to quickly note, though, the playful incongruity, the things that don't fit, that our expectations aren't met, it's got to be non-threatening. I mean, if I find a jack-o'-lantern in my refrigerator, as John Morell, a philosopher, uses as an example, that's incongruous and perhaps funny. But if I wake up with a severed horse's head in my bed, not expected, but not funny, right? I didn't expect this at all. Hilarious. Unlikely to be the response. That's a reference to a movie, by the way.
Godfather.
There you go. Godfather 2. Rare instance in which... Is it the second one?
I think it's the first one.
Oh, never mind. Okay. Anyway. So it's non-threatening incongruity. We'll talk about what makes it playful next time. Please keep up with the